In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Therapeutic Alliance. My goal for you in this lecture is to learn both what the Therapeutic Alliance is, how it's different from the psychotherapy relationship, why it's important to you as a therapist, and some of the factors that may moderate the relationship between the Therapeutic Alliance and outcome. At this point in the semester, and probably in your reading or in our discussions at some point, you might have been confused by terminology, and you might have heard me refer to things like the alliance, the therapy alliance, the relationship, the therapy relationship, and you might find yourself asking both then and now, what's the difference between those concepts? And the purpose of this slide is to hopefully have you understand those differences and be clear about what the different terms mean to you. Let's start with the relationship. And I really consider the relationship to be this umbrella term, this term that encapsulates all of the things that may be involved in the relationship that you have with your client. I provided you with the definition from your reading here by Gelso and Carter, both 1985, 1994, and they define the relationship as the feelings and attitudes that the therapist and client have toward one another and the manner in which these are expressed. Pretty broad, pretty global. It's meant to be because the relationship itself is pretty broad and pretty global. It contains all the things that you might do in a relationship with your client. The alliance, also referred to as the psychotherapeutic alliance, the psychotherapy relationship, or the working alliance, is something different than the relationship. It's more specific and more circumscribed in terms of what it means. Before we go into a current modern definition of that, I just wanted to provide you with a little history. And this history, as do many of the things that we've talked about and will talk about, goes back to the introduction of psychoanalytic thought and psychoanalytic psychotherapy within our country. And Freud in particular talked very much about the importance of the therapeutic alliance. And he actually differentiated between a number of different aspects of the alliance. He talked about, number one, the transference relationship, and the idea that the reaction a client might have to you in psychotherapy is based on their personal history. And in fact, they're not responding to the real you. They're not responding to the real relationship. They're responding to the relationship as though it's kind of a reenactment of their history. He also, while we're here, and I don't remember this being mentioned in any of the readings that you've had so far, but he also mentioned the countertransference relationship, and that is the relationship as it's perceived and experienced by you. So in this case, you're experiencing your client based on your own personal history and what you bring to the psychotherapy relationship. It's important to note right now, in something that's often overlooked when we talk about psychodynamic and analytic therapy and the relationship, that Freud and contemporary psychodynamic theorists differentiate between a positive and a negative transference relationship. So a negative relation or a negative transference relationship is one where I might perceive you in a negative way based on my personal history and experiences. That's often the uncomfortable feelings that you have in psychotherapy, both you and your client, to be honest with you. The positive transference, which a lot of people don't talk about as much, is one where the client perceives you in a positive way based on their history and their experience. And so they think of you like you're the best thing in the world, right? And the unfortunate part of that is often your positive transference or the client's positive transference reactions um, are often met with kind of some negative transference reactions when you let them down, or they're in contrast to that initial positive reaction that they have to you. Either way, both those positive and negative transference reactions are not based on the real you. They're based on the client's perception of you. That's a really, really important thing. So that is not you. It's not the actual relationship. It's based on a client's perception of you based on their history. Just like the countertransference relationship is based on your perception of the client based on your own history. Either one of those, and we'll talk about this later in the semester, requires you and the client to work through, whether it be in session together or in your own individual therapy or your own reflection on the work that you're doing. Now, to round out the history here, the psychodynamic, and Freud in particular, I like to give Freud credit when he deserves credit, talked about the real relationship. And that's what it was called. I'm not making that up. It's called the real relationship. The real relationship is an honest, accurate interpretation of who you are, of who I am as a client, and we engage in a real relationship based on not what I think you are, what my past tells me you might be, not my own fears, insecurities, whatever, but a real relationship that we form between each other. And that leads us to our kind of more modern definition of what the alliance is defined as. And typically when you look at this, and you read about some of the different measures and some of the different definitions over the years, typically the alliance is defined as two kind of broad yet interrelated factors. One is a bond warmth factor. When I tend to talk about this, I tend to emphasize the warmth part of this, but it's really a bond or a warmth thing. And that is like, I feel close to you, I feel connected to you, I feel good about you. You know this. I often say, like, if you want to know what the therapeutic alliance is, think about a relationship you have with another person. The people you feel closest to, you feel a certain bond with, you feel a certain warmth toward. The second factor is this collaboration or working together factor. And as you'll hear me talk about, you've already heard me talk about, this is the agreement on the goals and tasks of therapy. And so this second part of the alliance is, do we agree on what we're doing, where we're going, and how we're going to get there in psychotherapy? Now, I alluded to this earlier, but I'll say it again here to remind you. The relationship is kind of this more broad and broadly encompassing factor, right? It includes anything you might do in the relationship: validation, listening, positive regard, checking in on progress, repairing alliance ruptures. I could go on and on. The alliance is a more specific thing, and it specifically refers to the bond, warmth, collaboration, and working together factor. So we covered a lot of the definition of what the Therapy Alliance is in the last slide, but I wanted to talk about a few important things and important considerations when we talk about the Therapy Alliance, both from a how-to perspective and how it influences the work that we do, and also kind of from a research perspective. So let's start with a reminder, I think, in many ways, that the alliance refers to more specifically the collaborative relationship between the client and therapist. As we talked in the last slide, it also incorporates the bond and the warmth that's felt between client and therapist. As you read about, that warmth and bond often is important earlier in the relationship, not necessarily as much later in the relationship. If you think about this in terms of your own relationships, you often form a warm bond and connection with another person early when you meet them, later in your relationship, that sets the stage for times when you might not feel as close. You might feel aggravated. You might feel annoyed. You might feel misunderstood. And if you have that initial bond and that initial warmth, you're more likely to stay there, talk through those things, and deal with them as they come up in your relationship. Versus if you don't feel that initial warmth and bond with someone, you're like, I don't know if I want to go any further in this relationship. Same thing happens in psychotherapy here. And that's why I focus more on the collaborative element here, because it tends to be more important long term. But I don't want to undersell the importance of that initial warmth too. One thing to remember as we talk about this is the alliance is not one thing that you do once and then it's forever. Like any good relation, and actually this is a mistake I think a lot of people make in relationships, like, oh, I got a good relationship, I don't need to monitor it, I don't need to fix it, I don't need to develop it. Just like our own relationships with other people, that's a mistake, right? And so the therapist needs to attend to, build, and work on the relationship with their clients as they go through therapy. It's not something you do and you're done. It's something that you do and continue to work on. Just notice the typo there on the wit to client. Sounds like I'm from Philly. All right. So anyway, sorry for many of you from Philly. That wasn't meant as an insult. Anyways, all right. The negotiation part. We already talked about this. I'm not gonna spend too much time here. It involves negotiation of goals and tasks, and this is important early, but it's also important as you work through therapy. If your therapy is not going well, you may need to renegotiate goals and tasks. So it's something, again, like I mentioned a second ago, it's an ongoing process, not something that we agreed, we're done, we're good. We agreed now, we're done, we're good, but I may need to go back and renegotiate with my client based on their progress and treatment. Um, as I've alluded to, a good therapy alliance requires this attunement in response to both negativity as well as potentially positivity in the relationship and changes that may occur that are expressed by your clients. So you need to be constantly attuned to kind of this relational factor. And I'm sorry, I slipped there. The relational factor, you need to be constantly attuned to the alliance and how that alliance is going in potential ruptures so that you can then maintain and repair ruptures to that alliance as you go through it. The other thing, and this is kind of more of a measurement thing, as you read about, the alliance can be looked at by the therapist, the client, or an objective observer. And there are measures associated with each of these perspectives. As we will see in the next slide, the client and objective observers tend to be the most important and the most, I want to say most accurate, that's not true, the most highly correlated with outcome. And the lesson to take away here is that it really doesn't matter. I might be too extreme there, but it matters a lot less that you as a therapist think the alliance is good versus how your clients are rating your alliance. And most of the times you're not going to have an objective observer, but I think the key thing, my takeaway from this is like, I need to check in with my client to see how our relationship is going. And again, I said relationship, my alliance is going with them and not depend on my own observation of that. I just want to briefly mention here measurement issues. As you read about, there's kind of 4 alliance measures that are commonly used in the psychotherapy research literature. I just felt that that was important to mention. I don't know, all of those measures have a slightly different idea of what the alliance is and how to measure it. When I speak to you about what the alliance is and I give you definitions of the alliance, a lot of that is based on work that's been done to consolidate those measures. So if we look at all the measures out there, what are the things that they have in common? And then there's been some studies that have looked at some factor analytic studies that have looked at if we take all of the items on those scales, what tends to coalesce together, and how do we define those and name those? And that's where we get this kind of collaboration agreement on bonds and tasks and warmth or bond. That's what that research kind of tells us. So you might ask yourself, all right, well, wait, why are we talking about this again? And the reason that we're talking about this again is that the Therapeutic Alliance kind of rises to the top, if you will, in some ways in its relationship to psychotherapy outcome. The effect, and you see this as a quote from one of your readings, the effect is robust, right? And I include the 7.5% of the variance here, not because I need you to memorize it at 7.5%, but to stress the importance of the alliance outcome correlation. Now, and like the interesting thing about this, just before I go on, if we look at other relational factors that you've read about and talked about, this number, it's not that the alliance is like so much greater than like validation or so much greater than culture and modifying by culture. I almost think that the alliance sometimes gets this, I don't know, this praise that it doesn't always deserve. And again, I don't want to minimize the importance of it, but it's not like the alliance accounts for 40% of the variance and all these other relational factors account for 5. They're all around this number when you read this literature and look at that. Again, this means it's important, but we are only talking about 7.5% of the variance. Again, don't mean that to say this is not important, but I want to contextualize that within the rest of the outcome literature. Now, the other thing that you read about for this week is kind of what are some of the mediators and moderators of the psychotherapy alliance and its relationship to outcome. And I brought out 4. There's more in your reading. I think these are 4 of the kind of more important ones or more useful ones for you clinically. One is that alliance ratings later in psychotherapy are more strongly related to outcome. This is the thing that raises this question of like, is this a cause or an outcome? Which comes first? Is it, do I rate my alliance as good because I'm making good therapeutic progress? Or is the fact that my alliance is good related to my good therapeutic process? So it's this cause-effect kind of thing. And we don't have an answer to that, to be honest with you. All we know is that people who stay in therapy, rate their alliance as good, have better outcomes. Period. That's about what we can say at this point. The second thing, and I alluded to this already, client and observer ratings tend to be more predictive of outcome. What you think about your alliance, like, I don't know, it's important for you, I guess. But if you're not checking what you think about your alliance with your client, you're probably going to make mistakes. You're probably going to think you have a better alliance than your client thinks you do, and then their outcome may be less. They may drop out more. So the key takeaway here is check in with your clients, ask them about how they feel about the alliance, ask them if you're doing the things that you're supposed to be, or that they want you to be doing, and then move forward. We also know, and this is like interesting in relationship to other things that we will talk about, have talked about, will continue to talk about, tends to be independent of the type of psychotherapy. This goes back to the dodo bird effect, right? It doesn't matter if I'm doing cognitive, behavioral, dialectical behavioral, ACT, you get the point, psychodynamic, emotion focused. The alliance that you have with your client has to be good in order for that therapy to be effective. And then finally, there's some evidence that the importance of the alliance may vary by the client diagnosis. You read a lot about substance use disorders and the alliance tending to be less important with substance use disorders. The authors of the article that you read also point out that a lot of this research is done with um, more diverse populations, and they raise this question of whether or not there's a diversity by diagnosis interaction that might account for some understanding of this. It'd be an interesting thing for us to discuss in class. Substance use disorders are not the only one. Uh, Personality disorders is another kind of diagnosis where the literature tends to be a little variable, I guess is the best word. So what's the takeaway there? I'm not quite sure. Maybe if I'm working with a substance use disorder population, maybe the alliance is not as important as some other things. I guess maybe to monitor the importance of the alliance in relationship to my client's diagnostic status might be the main takeaway, although I don't love that takeaway. It's all the best I got right now. And then I'm going to close this lecture just by reminding you, many of the readings that I select for you have sample transcripts and suggestions at the end of how to do treatment, like how do I apply the work that, or the things that I've read to the actual treatment that I'm going to be eventually doing. These are easy things to kind of skip over when you're reading because you've got a lot to read, you've got a lot to do. I would encourage you not to do that. Read through the transcripts, read through the how-to, the ideas of how do you apply this to your practice. And remember that, in the not too distant future, you're going to be having to do this. And so to me, like even making a mental note of, oh, there are suggestions and ideas about how to do this and how to implement it in practice. And I should go back to this at a later time when I'm struggling with building an alliance with my client, or I'm thinking about how do I build my alliance with this client in my new practicum site. Go back to this reading, go back to those suggestions. I can tell you I've been at this for a long time, and when I review those and I look at those, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a really good thing, or that's something that I haven't thought about in a while, or maybe that's related to this particular client. It's part of why I love to teach psychotherapy, because it keeps me fresh, it keeps me integrated into the newest literature. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind, make a mental note of it, read it when you can. I pick those articles on purpose to give you how-to suggestions and give you ideas about what to do, how to do it, when to do it.